Hi, I'm Linda Wollersheim. I'm a doctoral researcher at Deakin University working with the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Electromaterial Science. Thank you for the opportunity of presenting today, and congratulations to the organisers for putting together a fantastic workshop in what was yet another challenging year indeed. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording this presentation. I'm on the land of the Djadjaburrung people in central Victoria in southeast Australia, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And last but not least, I would also like to thank my colleagues Dr. Peter Ferguson and Dr. Melanie Lowe for collaborating on a book chapter together, which is published in the Palgrave Handbook on Climate Resilient Societies. And I'm drawing on this work today in this presentation. I will begin the presentation by explaining some of the key terms and typologies used in our chapter, briefly speak to our methods before then presenting the key findings, and finishing up with some concluding thoughts on the importance of being mindful of the framing of resilience and sustainability in each of our work. Now, the title of the presentation promises a mapping of the main discourses in approaches to climate resilience and sustainable development. So what do we mean by discourse, and why do discourses constitute the main focus of this work? In a nutshell, a discourse is a shared way of understanding the world. According to Haier, it's an ensemble of ideas, concepts, and categorizations that are produced, reproduced, and transformed in a particular set of practices, and through which meaning is given to physical and social realities. So essentially, discourses are ideas, concepts, and categorizations embedded in language, and all discourses are built upon assumptions, conceived judgments and contentions that provide the basic terms for analysis. And as such, the object of discourse analysis, as we conduct in this chapter, is not the phenomenon itself, but rather the way in which actors make sense of and give meaning to linguistically represented political, social, ecological, or economic phenomena. And in our chapter, we explore the main discourses in approaches to climate resilience and sustainable development. Climate resilience, despite its real ubiquity across many fields, including economics and politics, international relations, global environmental change, urban planning, community and international development, public health, and energy, and many more, resilience still remains an ill-defined and somewhat contested concept. This has really generated multiple and often inconsistent articulations of the concept. So different actors have very different understandings of what climate resilience means, leaving the concept prone to co-optation into discourses that really can serve wildly divergent interests, actors, and contexts. And rather than formulating yet another definition of climate resilience, our chapter develops a framework for analyzing and categorizing existing climate resilience discourses, basically based upon their underlying conceptualization of resilience, their primary referent objects, and their main institutional proponents. And we use this framework to map the various articulations of climate resilience across 4 key areas of scholarship and practice, namely climate security, sustainable development, climate change-induced migration, and also urban climate resilience. And by mapping the various articulations of climate resilience, we demonstrate that there's 5 basic discourses of climate resilience that cut across most of these areas. Similarly, there are different understandings and meanings attached to the term sustainable development and sustainability as well. And just like resilience, sustainable development is therefore prone to co-optation into discourses that serve a range of different interests, actors, and contexts. Brundtland's famous original definition of sustainable development, of course, was development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But this has really since been contested by different understandings of the term sustainable and also different understandings of the term development and the implications of their collocation. There are numerous frameworks for analyzing and categorizing sustainable development discourses, as well as differing typologies, which I'll get to shortly. But this presentation today presents some of the findings of earlier work where my colleague Dr. Peter Ferguson and I conducted a discursive mapping exercise investigating the relationship between sustainable development and resilience in climate security discourse. We scrutinized the underlying assumptions about power dynamics, the feasibility of ongoing economic growth, the role of technology and capital substitution in solving ecological problems in existing sustainable development and resilience discourses. And then we identified 5 key relationships between sustainable development and resilience discourses. Without wanting to go into too much detail here, the methods we used are similar in the earlier work I just mentioned, as well as in the book chapter that I'm presenting on today. So we started by conducting a comprehensive literature review in our respective fields of expertise, analyzing the key taxonomic schemes and categorizations of resilience and sustainable development discourses. We then examined the underlying assumptions and conceptualizations of resilience and sustainable development by systematically applying our developed framework, which basically classifies how the discourse distributes responsibilities and risks, namely which primary referent objects it identifies. And lastly, then we also identify some of the main institutional actors who articulate each discourse, which is all listed in more detail in our chapter. I already alerted to the fact that there are numerous understandings and typologies of resilience and sustainable development. But typologies of resilience discourse generally begin with Holling's juxtaposition between engineering resilience, which is defined as the capacity of a system to return to a fixed point of equilibrium in the face of perturbation, and ecological resilience, which seeks to preserve a system's underlying functions rather than maintain a single equilibrium state. Now, we argue that these categories are problematic for a number of reasons, including assuming that resilience is always about positive adaptation, and conceiving of resilience in sort of binary terms, so suggesting a system or entity is either resilient or not resilient, when in reality systems tend to actually exhibit degrees of resilience. Now, therefore, we adopt Bourbeau's threefold conceptual framework for understanding resilience as a process of patterned adjustments adopted by a society or an individual in the face of endogenous or exogenous shocks. And this threefold conceptual framework basically consists of the least radical resilience as maintenance, which seeks to maintain the status quo after a shock or disturbance by bouncing back in the face of perturbation. Secondly, somewhat a more radical resilience as marginality, which prescribes reforms at the margins but does not challenge the fundamental premises upon which policymaking and prevailing socioeconomic and socio-ecological structures are built. So this is often based on the idea of adaptation to climatic changes. And third, there's the most radical approach, which is resilience as renewal, really implying extensive changes to basic policy assumptions and even the reconstruction of underlying socioeconomic and socio-ecological structures. And this is encapsulated by the ideas of transformation and bouncing forward. Likewise, I alerted to the numerous understandings and typologies of sustainable development already. Key taxonomic schemes of sustainable development discourse that are found in the literature include a whole range of schemes such as bipartite taxonomic schemes, diagrammic schemes, also more complex visual and cognitive mapping approaches, as well as a range of comprehensive typologies. In the interest of time, I won't explore all of them, but would refer you to our publication, which does analyze and alert to these types of different typologies in more detail. As I mentioned, by systematically applying our developed framework, we seek to identify how a discourse distributes responsibilities and risks, namely which entities it sees as existentially threatened by climate change. Now, in our chapter, we reformulate the concept of primary referent objects as borrowed from security studies to broaden the concept to include any valued entity that is considered at risk from climate change and which is ascribed the potential to become more resilient in order to manage climatic disruption. In recognition of the increasing interconnectedness, increased unpredictability and uncontrollability of the Earth system occasioned by the Anthropocene, we adopt the view that rather than constituting discrete or fixed entities, referent objects can also be understood as systemic entities, such as the socio-ecological systems or ecosystems. So here you see our applied framework, identifying climate resilience discourses in climate security literature, climate resilience discourses identified in literature and practice on sustainable development, the main climate resilience discourses identified in literature and practice on climate change-induced migration and mobility, and fourth, the main urban climate resilience discourses that we identify and discuss in our chapter. I'll now speak about the 5 basic discourses of climate resilience as identified across these 4 areas of scholarship and practice. And the first and most prevalent basic discourse cutting across all 4 areas is neoliberal resilience. Fundamentally, neoliberal resilience is concerned with preserving the neoliberal socioeconomic system. But more often than not, this systemic referent is actually routinely obscured by the emphasis on instructing vulnerable states and their citizens to enhance their own resilience through participation in labor, commodity, insurance, and other market processes. So neoliberal resilience essentially individualizes the responsibility to adapt and respond to climatic disruption. Now, however, this does not address fundamental causes of vulnerability, of course, and in many respects actually increases the vulnerability through exposing populations and ecosystems to fluctuations of global markets. Second, all 4 areas analyzed exhibit a form of resilience that focuses on restoring socio-ecological systems to their previous state in response to climatic disruption. So we categorize this as reactive resilience discourse, which is built upon an underlying conceptualization of resilience as maintenance and variously adopts discrete reference, such as vulnerable individuals or vulnerable communities, as well as systemic reference, including the neoliberal economic system and ecosystems. Third, the climate security, sustainable development, and migration mobility areas articulate a security-based resilience discourse, in which resilience is usually conceived of in terms of maintenance or marginality, and sometimes as renewal as well. In climate security discourses, a full range of referent objects are articulated, ranging from discrete entities such as vulnerable individuals and communities to systemic reference, including economic systems, ecosystems, and socio-ecological systems, as well as the global states system. Fourth, we have across climate security, sustainable development, and urban climate resilience, an ecological resilience discourse. In all three cases, the key systemic reference are ecosystems, while resilience is generally understood as renewal. And the fifth climate resilience discourse, transformational resilience, is articulated in the urban climate resilience, climate security, and sustainable development areas, whereby resilience is explicitly articulated in terms of renewal, while communities, ecosystems, and complex socio-ecological systems are the primary discrete and systemic referent objects. Moving then to the 5 key relationships between sustainable development and resilience discourses as articulated in climate security literature. The first position understands resilience as a precondition of sustainable development, while the second perspective is that resilience is an extension of sustainable development. A third perspective points to the emergence of resilience as a response to the failure of neoliberal sustainable development to really live up to its promise to improve living standards in developing countries and to protect ecosystems globally. A fourth set of perspectives holds that in some articulations resilience is qualitatively different to sustainable development. And finally, the fifth perspective understands resilience as a discourse to integrate climate security and sustainable development. And this is just a very quick overview here. So as I mentioned, this work is explored in more detail in a book chapter conducted by Dr. Peter Ferguson and myself, and also in an upcoming publication. Now, while in reality, discourses are, of course, more fluid and hybrid than the categories identified in our chapter and that I spoke to just in this presentation, but our developed framework seeks to clarify the various ways in which different actors understand climatic risks and vulnerability, how these factors are both exacerbated and mitigated, and also who is held responsible for causing and alleviating these dynamics. Now, this in turn then enables a deeper understanding of the ways the language of resilience and sustainable development really shapes debates about and responses to contemporary global environmental change, and it can provide analysts as well as practitioners with a helpful framework to propose and implement climate resilience measures that aim to benefit the world's most vulnerable human populations and ecosystems. The ways in which we articulate and conceptualize climate risks and vulnerability really then shape our understandings of resilience and sustainable development, which in turn, as I said, shapes contemporary debates about and responses to global environmental change. So I think it's really critical, therefore, that we are mindful of how discourses serve very divergent interests, actors, and contexts, and that we adapt our language carefully as a result. I will leave it at that for today, and would like to thank you for listening to my presentation today. Please do get in touch if you have any questions or feedback. My email address is detailed here. Thank you.